launching of this Competence Centre. I will refer to measuring consumer conditions in the EU. So just to situate a bit the issue, we are talking about the consumer scoreboards, which are, let's say, the backbone of consumer evidence that my unit produces to inform not just consumer policy, but many other policies. And there are two types of consumer scoreboards. One is the consumer market scoreboard, which monitors performance of individual markets in EU member states, plus Norway and Iceland, according to several dimensions like trust, comparability, choice, problems and detriments, expectations and switching is experienced by consumers. And this creates a composite indicator called the Market Performance Index. And then the Consumer Condition Scoreboard, which will be the main focus of my presentation today, benchmarks the national consumer environment and also looks at cross-border business-to-consumer trade and in particular e-commerce. And it has as composite indicator the Consumer Conditions Index. Now, with the scoreboards, this have been in existence for almost 8 years now. We have a data series. We can really compare performance between markets, countries, and examine trends. And in terms of the policy uptake, of course, the EU semester is let's say, a very good anchor for this evidence, but as well sectoral policies, for instance, energy policy, digital single market, and I will refer in more detail later. So, focusing now on the Consumer Conditions Scoreboard, I will illustrate it with the latest edition that was published in September of last year, because it was the first edition following a thorough methodological revision for which we partnered with the JRC, with the team that will be the nucleus of this Competence Centre. And what we've done was first to revisit the conceptual framework. What is it that we want to measure? What are consumer conditions? And the way they were conceptualized are, it's by distinction both with the structural market conditions, which are dealt with by, other policy areas like competition policy, social policies, and also the outcome in terms of consumer welfare, satisfaction or detriment. So the consumer conditions would sit in between and would sort of define the environment that allows consumers to, starting from a certain structural situation, to attain certain outcomes. I will not spend too much time describing this because there is a very interesting scientific paper already published by the JRC explaining this conceptual work. We've also revisited the survey questionnaires, but here with the concern for maintaining to the extent possible comparability, I mentioned that a strength of the scoreboards are this time series. So in order to be able to measure change, we should really be careful on how we change the measures indeed. So the change to the surveys has been incremental, and we have also done with the JRC significant work on building the composite indicator. And the way it was built is mainly centered on 3 pillars: knowledge and trust, compliance and enforcement, and complaints and dispute resolution, with perspectives from both retailers and consumers feeding into it. And this is, the detailed composition of this consumer conditions index. As I said, the 3 pillars. The first one is further divided into 2 sub-pillars, knowledge and trust. The 3 main pillars have all equal weights, and you see that they are quite balanced in terms of data from the retailer perspective and from the consumer perspective. And there has been a very thorough work on statistical auditing of this indicator, in building the components. There's been correlation analysis, principal component analysis, and also afterwards, it was tested for robustness, particular uncertainty analysis, to make sure that the weights will not create dramatic variations. I will refer now to the scoreboard itself and the way we have chosen to present the composite index. We have actually chosen to emphasize intermediary levels of aggregation because these carry, in a way, more political significance, more policy relevance. So you see here the three main pillars illustrated in terms of country performance. Countries divided into 4 groups. So knowledge and trust, compliance and enforcement, and complaints and dispute resolution. We have also presented quite a few individual indicators or even lower levels of aggregation. For instance, here you see an indicator that illustrates consumers and retailers' trust in environmental claims. And this is part of the higher component on the pillar on knowledge and trust. It's always interesting to, or often interesting to look at outliers. And I've chosen to show this. Why? Because here on this particular indicator we see Germany, for instance, as a huge outlier on trust in environmental claims both by consumers and retailers, while on the higher up component on trust and knowledge, Germany scores very well. So in spite of a very bad score on this particular indicator. Why is this interesting? Because remember when the Volkswagen scandal erupted late last year, there were questions on whether anyone knew or had any hint in Europe about the situation. Well, what we can tell is, for instance, that in Germany both retailers and consumers were very skeptical about environmental claims. We've had such situations in the past as well, where some of our indicators, in hindsight, could be linked to subsequent developments. For instance, in the consumer market scoreboard, we have been showing Bulgarian consumers with a very negative, a huge outlier with a very negative assessment and ranking last consistently in terms of the energy markets, in particular electricity, and sort of frustration building up, which erupted actually in early 2013 in demonstration and riots that linked to the energy markets that led even to a change in government. We have looked, outliers are outliers, but also correlations are interesting. So we have analyzed internal correlations between various indicators that feed into the composites. For instance, we find that the enforcement activities are highly positively correlated with compliance and negatively correlated with the reported prevalence of illegal practices, like unfair commercial practices. This is non-trivial because the usual storyline is the more enforcement activities you do, the more visible enforcement activities are, then this creates a perception that there is low compliance. So we have shown that this is not really the case. Also, for instance, what retailers say about the role of public authorities and consumer NGOs in monitoring compliance is positively correlated with consumers' trust in these organizations, in authorities and the NGOs in monitoring this compliance. And also it's it's interesting that the aggregate, and the aggregate, as I said, we de-emphasized it in the presentation, but one area where we still kept referring to it is to highlight some interesting correlations with other indicators. For instance, okay, with economic indicators like GDP, household consumption, disposable income, global competitiveness index, but also interestingly with governance indicators. Most of the World Bank governance indicators are correlated with our consumer conditions index, and in particular very high correlation with rule of law and voice and accountability indicators, and also social indicators, so negative correlation with material deprivation rate and inequality, interestingly, and positive correlation with the gender equality index of the European Union. This is a sample. We have also country fishes, so it's always a challenge what to present, how to present, because there is a lot of data there. Here you see a sample country fish from this 2015 scoreboard, where you see at the bottom we show how the country positions or ranks in the three main dimensions, which we consider are the higher or the highest aggregation level that has a meaningful or immediate obvious policy significance. And there you will see that there are tables where also the evolution in time, but also the difference from the EU average is mentioned. And you see in red this huge difference with Germany much more negatively scoring on trust in environmental claims. Now the scoreboard, because I'm
sorry, could you conclude in 1 minute? Sorry, Mike again.
Okay, I'll go very fast. Just to show some findings in the digital area, for instance, that consumers tend to trust a lot less buying online cross-border than in their own country. Also, in terms of obstacles to cross-border e-commerce from a consumer perspective, delivery, contractual rights rank high. Every spending, we see, for instance, consumers in Eastern Europe spend overall less buying online, but proportionally more buying cross-border within the EU. We even presented this map pattern of where people are buying from, and showing the intensity of cross-border e-commerce. We've produced for the first time hard evidence showing that consumers are not aware many times when they buy cross-border from other EU member states, they assume they buy domestically, and this has policy implications, and last December the Commission has actually put forward an initiative to fully harmonize key contractual rights. Now I will refer very quickly, and this is the last slide, to some lessons learned, some takeaways from this experience. And I don't want to preempt, because the GRC has announced that they will work also on a paper with the lessons learned from revisiting the consumer scoreboards. Of course, composite indicators are always challenging because they involve trade-offs, for instance, between simplicity and policy relevance. And there's no perfect indicator, so you need to make decisions on these trade-offs. In terms of substance, it is important to have this underlying theory. What is it that we're trying to measure, and why it makes sense to group certain indicators together? Statistical soundness, so to make sure that they are grouped together in a composite in the right way, and while staying policy relevance, and this is a matter of presentation also, and sometimes you need to have intermediary levels of aggregation. The presentation has to be, of course, accessible and meaningful from the reader and from a policy perspective. And I cannot emphasize enough how important the process is, and that has been our experience, especially when revising something. So it is very important to have stakeholders on board. This ensures the ownership and the legitimacy of the indicators, to refer to international good practices, have specialist input, and here I would encourage working with the JRC, because really they are experts in this area. And also important is to allow sufficient time and resources. This takes time and takes resources, and this breathing space is very important to ensure quality result. And thank you, and I would just mention that also the Consumer Market Scoreboard has been through the same type of process, and the first revised edition is due to be published at the end of the spring. Thank you.